This is lecture 10C for History 111. I've been talking about Byzantine Empire and the Byzantine heyday. Now we're going to talk about the decline of the Byzantine Empire. So the real heyday of the Byzantine Empire was the 500s and early 600s. And the real backbone of the Byzantine power was not necessarily its own productivity. It had some productive regions like Egypt, but it was rather that it had enormous trade power. And the reason for that is it was location. That the Byzantine Empire controlled southeastern Europe, the Balkans, and Greece, but it also controlled Constantinople, and it controlled a big chunk of the Black Sea, and then it controlled Anatolia and down into Syria and then into Egypt and across North Africa. And this meant that it was at the center of multiple trade routes. First of all, Egypt traded with southern portions of Africa, and Egyptians then could trade up to the Byzantine Empire, and if they wanted to go north into Europe, they really went through the Black Sea and then up into the Russian river systems. And so trade passing north to south went through the Byzantine Empire, in particular through Egypt and then Constantinople. And then east to west, the Silk Roads all tended to end at the Byzantine Empire, either at Constantinople or at Damascus. And maritime trade coming up through the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea also went through Byzantine territory. So the Byzantine Empire really made enormous amounts of money off of all this trade passing through. And this was the source of enormous power because money can get translated into armies and things like that. So this was the heyday of Byzantine power. But the Byzantines would get entangled with a whole series of wars that would really cripple it, and then it would spend its last several centuries limping along. The first of the problems was that under Justinian, the Byzantines got into a war with the Sassanids. And I talked about this in a previous lecture, that the Byzantines were trying to reconquer Italy with Belisarius, and they had to recall that army because they'd gotten into the war with the Sassanids. This war with the Sassanids, the Persian Empire, would drag on for over a century. That basically, the Sassanids control Persia and parts of Mesopotamia. The Byzantines control Syria and Anatolia and Egypt, and they want parts of Mesopotamia. And essentially, they would be fighting over not just Mesopotamia, but the front would move. The Sassanids would invade, and they'd conquer big chunks of Syria and et cetera. And then the Byzantines would push back, and they would actually stage daring invasions of northern Persia and things like that. And they caused massive destruction everywhere. And not only that, but both governments had to raise taxes to try to pay for all these armies. So they're destroying each other's economies, they're destroying trade, and they're spending all this money on armies, and they're raising taxes. And it just dragged on and on and on until it's dragging on into the 600s. And there's no real end in sight. And so their populations began to get exhausted and impoverished, and they began to hate their own governments. And then, while this is dragging on and it looks like it's just going to become a war of attrition, suddenly out of the Arabian Peninsula, this new force emerges, this religiously motivated army of Arabs creating a Muslim empire. And these Arab armies coming out of the Arabian Peninsula would discover that they could attack Syria or something, and they would just they'd send a few thousand troops, maybe 10,000 soldiers on horseback, or maybe 20,000, and they would discover that they might have to fight a war with the Byzantines, but the Byzantine armies were not in great shape, and if they beat them, they had free reign, right? And so the Arabs found it was really easy to conquer Syria and then to conquer Egypt. And so the Byzantines are just losing territory right and left. Now, they weren't alone. I'll talk in the next lecture about they actually knock off the entire Sassanid Empire, the Muslims do. But for the Byzantine point of view, losing Syria and Egypt is a major blow to their finances and the treasury, because those are major sources of wealth. But it gets worse, because the Muslim armies would then attack Anatolia, and they would actually besiege Constantinople itself in 717. Now, it really looked bad. The Muslim army was 80,000 at this point, and they have this navy, and they're blockading the harbor, and it really looks like Constantinople is going to fall. But this Byzantine general stages a coup gets rid of the emperor, names himself Emperor Leo III, and then he stages a brilliant defense of Constantinople. One of the things they had is the Byzantines had always had a good navy. Constantinople has fantastic fortifications, but they also had Greek fire, and we don't know what this is now, or what it was. We've lost the recipe, so to speak, but it was apparently something kind of like an ancient version of napalm. It was a substance that they could put into catapults on ships, and they could light it on fire, and they could throw it and toss it over against other ships, and it would stick to whatever it landed on, and it would burn, and you couldn't put it out with water. And so it was really nasty stuff. And the Byzantines used this on the Muslim navies, and they caused enormous destruction there. And in the end, in 718, they finally lift the siege and push the Muslims back. But by this point, Constantinople is the head of a pretty small empire. I mean, the Byzantines have lost, most of the eastern Mediterranean. They basically have southeastern Europe and Greece and a little bit of Anatolia left, but that's it. They've lost Syria, they've lost Egypt, they've lost their territories in Mesopotamia, they've lost all the revenues that went with all that stuff. And so they're kind of crippled. Now, they would hold on, but then they begin to see a new threat emerging. Okay, I'm going to go into what all the Muslim empires and dynasties are next lecture, but under the Abbasid Empire, which is a Muslim empire beginning in the 750, the Abbasids used to hire Turks to become soldiers for them. Now, the Turks did not live in Turkey at this point. Turks came from Central Asia, and they were nomads. They herded horses and sheep and things across the open steppes in Central Asia, and so the Turks would they were great horseback riders, and so they would go south. They would migrate south into Persia, and the Abbasids would hire them as soldiers. But some of these Turks discovered that maybe after being in the army with the Abbasids for a while, they would discover that a great way to make a living was simply to go to the territory. There's sort of a borderland between the Byzantine territory and the Abbasids in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. And the Turks found that they could just hang out there, and they could stage these massive raids into Byzantine territory and destroy, rob, pillage, and loot towns and cities. They'd have tens of thousands of soldiers, and nobody could stop them. And the Byzantines are trying to chase them down with their armies, but they have a hard time catching them because the Turks are all on horseback, and they're all fast. This is causing enormous problems for the Byzantines. And so they keep hoping that sooner or later they'll be able to corner the Turks and destroy them. And they finally get their wish in 1071 at a place called Manzikert. And initially, and basically it was about an army of, I'm not sure the numbers, some 20,000 Turks or something. And the Byzantines corner them and force them to stand and fight. And so the Turks start to fight, and the Byzantines have heavy infantry in the middle, and they have cavalry on the sides, and they have a pretty good strategy for fighting the Turks, and it works, and they beat the Turks, and the Turks start to retreat. But then the Byzantines break formation and start chasing the Turks, and the Turks realize that this is an opportunity, because as long as the Byzantines are in formation, the Turks couldn't really do much against them. But when the Byzantine cavalry starts chasing them, they leave the infantry behind, and so the Turks turn around and they just attack the cavalry again. And this time they completely destroy the Byzantine cavalry, and then they can go and destroy the Byzantine infantry because the infantry is vulnerable without the cavalry guarding its flanks. And so they destroy the entire Byzantine army. And not only that, but they kill the Byzantine emperor himself. Well, the Turks don't have the organization to take advantage of this. They basically just destroyed the only army the Byzantines have, and they could have just taken the Byzantine Empire, but they didn't have the organization. They didn't know this. So the Turks basically just go on their way, and the Byzantines are in this bad way. And so the next Byzantine emperor sends a letter off to the Pope in Rome, and he says, hey, you're Christians, we're Christians, these Muslim Turks are attacking us, and they're going to wipe us out. So as fellow Christians, you should help us. Well, this is kind of a funny thing to say at that time, because in 1054, the Pope in Rome and the Metropolitan of Constantinople had excommunicated each other. So the churches had split definitively in 1054, and now, 17 years later, the Byzantines are saying, hey, can you guys help us out, fellow Christians? Well, the Pope ignores it in 1079. He ignores the Byzantine call for help. But the Byzantines are still suffering from the Turks, and in 1095, the next Byzantine emperor decides to try again. He sends another letter to the Pope. This time it's Pope Urban II, and the Pope this time realizes that he wants to help. And it's not just because he wants to help fellow Christians against Muslims. It's more that he sees this as a way to boost the power of the papacy. This might be a way to get control of new territory, etc. So he decides to launch a crusade. So he calls on European nobles all over Europe to join a crusade to go help the Byzantines. Well, in fact, he doesn't. He changes the objective. The Byzantines just want a bunch of soldiers to help defend their city against the Turks. But what the Pope does is he says, let's go conquer Jerusalem and take it back from the Muslims. And so they send this big army, and it's a huge army, and it's a fantastic army because this is the cream of the of European chivalry and military power. And they show up, and the Byzantines are like, oh my gosh, you guys are way more than we wanted. And they're worried that these guys are going to conquer Constantinople. So they send them on their way. They say, oh, you want to go conquer Jerusalem? You go. But this is just the beginning. And basically for the next 200 years, Christians would periodically be sending crusading armies into the Middle East, and the Byzantines would have to deal with this. And sometimes they were allies with the Byzantines, and this was great, but sometimes they were a problem. On the Fourth Crusade, the Crusaders decided to sail from Venice to the Middle East to attack Jerusalem, but the Venetians asked them to stop along the way, and because there was a civil war going on in the Byzantine Empire between two guys claiming to be the emperor, and the Venetians wanted one guy to win. So they told the Crusaders that they had to stop and help their guy win in Constantinople first, and then they could go to the crusade. Well, the Crusaders agree to this, and they get dropped off in the Byzantine Empire, and they actually wind up getting into an argument or a fight with the guy the Venetians wanted to be emperor, and they kill him. And then they go off and they wipe out the other guy, and they seize Constantinople. They take Constantinople, and they basically loot the city. I mean, they're just like ripping stuff out of churches, and they're raping and pillaging and drinking everything. They loot the city, and then they just sort of sit down, and the Crusaders hold on to the city for 55 years. Right? They don't leave until 1261. And so, this really weakens the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Byzantines eventually kick the Crusaders out in 1261 and reestablish control. But the Byzantine Empire is just getting weaker and weaker. And finally, in the 1400s, and the Turks finally get organized in the 1300s under the Ottoman Empire. And in 1453, the Ottoman Sultan would finally attack Constantinople and destroy it. He wouldn't destroy the city, but he would take Constantinople and destroy the Byzantine Empire. So the Byzantine Empire finally comes to an end in 1453, although it had been weakening for a long time. It really, after the siege of 700s, it had been getting weaker and weaker, and by the time the Ottomans knocked it off in 1453, it was a shell of its former self. So that is the story of the Byzantine Empire.